Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that Israel would hit back hard against anyone who attacked his country. This is in response to an Iranian missile strike in US-led forces in Iraq. Iranian forces launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles against two military bases in Iraq, marking the most significant attack in the growing conflict with the United States. The rockets fired at the Ain al-Assad base in Anbar province and a base in Erbil came amid escalating tensions over the US killing of Iranian military commander Qasem Soleimani in Iraq last week. US officials say that there are no initial reports of any casualties from the attack, but an assessment of the impact of the strikes is underway. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei says that the attack is a slap in the face for the US. Well, for more on this story, we now cross to our correspondent in Washington, Nina Maria Potts. Nina, thanks so much indeed for joining us. I suppose all eyes on Washington, and we wait for this response from President Trump.
Correct. And I mean, it's also, of course, wider North America that is now being dragged into the situation in Tehran and Iran and the conflict between the US and Iran. By that I mean, of course, Canada, which lost the highest number of victims in this crash, this Ukrainian International Airlines crash, and of course Boeing, whose jet went down amid growing speculation that it's at least too premature to blame mechanical failure for this crash. This at a time where the US and Iran appear to be on the brink of war. I think despite the fact that Iran's supreme leader has called this a slap in the face, as you rightly say, but not enough, it depends, I think, slightly on what the wider Iranian government decides to do next, how Washington responds. We've had a signal from Iran's foreign minister perhaps offering an off-ramp and leaving it there. Iran certainly can't afford to go to a full-scale war with Washington. We've not yet heard from President Trump, who was due to give a statement or a briefing this morning, which we're waiting for to see how far he will go. Democrats on Capitol Hill, meanwhile, pushing very swiftly to bring in legislation, perhaps as early as Thursday, to attempt to limit the scope of the president's war powers.
Is there any indication at all at this stage what President Trump might say at this briefing? We know what he said overnight. He seems to be quite calm, but I'm sure that behind the scenes, it's a tricky chess game that they're trying to navigate.
Well, on the domestic front and personally for President Trump, he has already scored somewhat of a victory because the main issue in Washington, if you remember, before Christmas was the impeachment proceeding against President Trump. The fact that Congress has been left scrambling to deal with effectively the president bringing the U.S. To the brink of war has meant at the very least that that tactic perhaps of distraction politics is working, and Congress and Democrats on Congress are enraged to be finding themselves dealing with a war rather than being able to push ahead with the president's impeachment trial. So on the domestic level, that signals very much of a victory for President Trump. What he's planning to do next is I think anyone's guess, partly because he's been taking fairly unilateral decisions, expressing those decisions, making them public on Twitter. Still no indication that the White House is going to provide evidence that Soleimani, the top general, Iran's top general that the US took out, which prompted this retaliation, still no indication that the White House plans to declassify any evidence that he provided any imminent threat at all.
All right, as with most things in America, it's either red or blue, no matter what the issue is. And I would imagine lawmakers right now are exchanging words on both sides of this issue. And what voices are coming through?
Well, we've heard from Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's been very outspoken, slamming last night Iran's retaliatory military maneuvers, the missile attacks, as an act of war. We've also heard from figures like Rand Paul, who have questioned the decision to target and kill Iran's top general. However, I think Republicans are largely behind President Trump. I think a lot will depend on how President Trump's base responds to the fact that he has gone where the Obama administration refused to go, which is to up the ante. We've got 3,500 U.S. troops readying for deployment to the Middle East. How that will play, certainly in rural America, but in communities where they lost many vets in the Iraq War. It very much, I think, depends whether or not he has been able to galvanize and get that support. At the moment, there's no indication that Republican support at his base certainly is about to drop away.
So a lot of the discussion has been about how Iran is having to think about exercising restraint because they can't afford a war, and this crippling sanctions, etc., etc. But I wonder, on the American side, what do they have to lose? Because they also can't want to go to war.
I think it's a very good question, and it's going to require the political will of Congress behind President Trump, to see how far he will be able to go unilaterally. There is a lot of surprise among experts here in Washington that Iran has claimed credit so openly and claimed responsibility for these missile attacks. Previous sort of signs of aggression from Iran have been through proxies. So, I'm thinking of Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen. So I think although the Iranian government cannot afford, that's the consensus, to go to war with the US. And although the Iranian government appears to be trying, or at least the foreign minister, to calm the rhetoric, and it may be that these missile attacks is where it all stops, nonetheless, there is no sense of control as to what Iran might do through proxies in the wider region, and how the US is then positioned to tackle that enormous regional instability and uncertainty, I think, at this moment.
All right, so Nina Maria Ponce, we're going to have to leave it there for the time being. Let's wait and see what the president does finally say. I'm sure the whole world is waiting to see, not just Iran. Thanks so much indeed for your time and your insights. All right, that's our U.S. correspondent, Nina Maria Ponce, who's in Washington, and we are standing by to get that statement from the President of the United States, Donald Trump, about what Iran did in retaliation to the assassination of their military commander. Well, let's take this story a little further, and we're now joined from our Pretoria studio by Iran's ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Movahhedi Ghomi. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, Ambassador. So your thoughts on the strike that your country did in America? The Supreme Leader said that this was a slap in the face in America. Does that mean that more might come?
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello, Your Excellency. I was just saying that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini says that this attack on the American bases was a slap in the face for the US. Does this suggest that Iran might do more?
Good afternoon, Mr. Peter, and thank you very much have me here. Yes, as you stated, as the Supreme Leader stated this word, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Dr. Zarif, announced that we did and concluded, appropriated and proportionate measure in self-defense under the Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, defending ourselves, and attacked the base of the United States in Iraq, which used to attack against the Iranian citizens and major official conducted from that base. We believe that we can take it as a concluded step at this time now.
All right. Are you not worried that this act may escalate things and that it could lead to a much bigger conflict between your country and the United States?
Yes, as we mentioned before, we are not looking for, we are not seeking escalation and war in the region, but we will defend ourselves strongly against any aggression and invade against Iran. But we are not looking for bring the war into our region, to our country.
What would you like the United States to do? What would settle this issue once and for all for you?
As a matter of fact, the United States administrative and the government must be logic, must be very reasonable actors in this regard. What they did, unfortunately, caused the war action in the region, and that government is responsible for any act in this regard. We did based on our right to do it under the Charter of the United Nations. It's better to accept the consequences of his act in this regard.
He says that this was an act of self-defense. That's President Trump. Is that something that you are understanding, or are you saying that you were provoked?
You mean Iran?
Yes.
No, no, as I mentioned, we are not looking for any provocation act in provocating the region, and in this regard, and we did, and as we promised, we did in the framework of our self-defense. Before it, we alarmed them repeatedly. The time of the heat and runaway is finished now. Iran is not in the stand to accept all this kind of the aggression against its people.
Has there been any communication between your country and Washington at this stage at all?
Yes, the Swiss ambassador in Tehran is responsible for.
And what's being communicated?
You know, the very urgent messages is going to be exchanged normally between the two sides. Is a diplomatic channel is between the two countries, but this is for the urgent cases. Unfortunately, the United States, by these acts, and especially after the withdrawal from the JCPOA and trying to enforce its policy and the program to this pact against Iran, negotiation is stopped.
The nuclear deal 2015, you've pulled back from that. Is there any chance that that can be revisited if there is a solution found for the current crisis?
We announced that the fifth step of the JCPOA is that we announced our step It doesn't mean that we withdraw from the JCPOA. We are working with the other member of the JCPOA and also IAEA. In this regard, we announced that we will reverse when the sanctions removed, and the Europeans accept and conduct their promise in this regard.
All right. Your Excellency, I'm just wondering, in the coming days, a lot of pressure is coming from all sides. The Europeans are talking about de-escalation. You're saying you're not wanting war. What do you think might happen if President Trump says that some kind of retaliation is required for what your country did to their bases?
Over retaliation.
Will you continue to defend yourself with more acts?
At this level, we concluded, but if any other attack be done by the U.S., we are going to answer broadly and strongly in this regard at the commander of the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran announced this morning in Tehran.
What's your fear for the region as a whole? Because what's happening in Iran, Iraq, does affect the region in its entirety. And we're hearing some pretty strong words coming out of Israel as well, saying that they will defend themselves by any means necessary if anybody attacks them.
The presence of the U.S. in the region unfortunately brought the division, war, destructive and demolition of the infrastructure in the region. They caused this war. And based on the fact that Israel all the time supported fully and bring the U.S. And supporting fully it to the region. Both countries, the U.S. and also the Israel, are responsible for any problem in the region. We Iranian, with the other countries in the Middle East, used to live for centuries without any problem. We know how to conduct each other, we understand each other, but interfering of the external powers of the foreign superpowers came to the region. The U.S. not recently, during the last few decades, unfortunately lots of the problem in the Middle East. We are looking for the peace, tranquility and the prosper of our nations, in spite of the Iran, Iraq, and the other countries around us.
All right. Your Excellency, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you so much indeed.